In this video, I'm going to show you how to get started with Pinia, the incredible new state management library for Vue 3 Composition API apps, in around 30 minutes. If you're new here, my name's Danny Connell. I'm an indie app developer and creator of Fudget, the highest rated personal finance app for iOS, Android, Mac and Windows. And if you want to grab that, just search for Fudget on your app store. I also create videos on Vue.js, cross-platform apps and VS Code and much more. So if you don't want to miss videos like this, then make sure you click subscribe and click the bell. And you can also find all of my premium courses at dannys.link/courses, including my new course, Vue.js 3 Composition API with Pinia and Vite, where I explain Pinia in much more detail. Well, what we're going to do here is create this simple counter app, which has multiple pages. And you can see this counter always stays in sync regardless of where we go in our app. And at first we're going to create this app in the usual Vue.js and Composition API way by adding reactive data, methods and computed properties. And then we're going to move all of our data, methods and computed properties into a Pinia Store, which you can see here, into state, actions and getters. And we'll also cover two-way binding, how to use our store everywhere, and child components. I'll also explain what Pinia is and why you would want to use it later on in the video. Let's get started by creating a new Vue 3 project. So I'm going to Google Vue 3 and jump to the Vue.js documentation site, click on install and scroll down. And we need to have Node.js installed before we can create a project. So if you just click on that link, you probably want to install the stable version, which is on the left there. And once that's installed, we can then create a Vue project with this command here. So I'm going to copy that and jump to my terminal, which is just running within VS Code, which is the editor I'm going to be using. I'll paste that command in and launch that. And for the project name, which is also the folder name, I'm going to use learn-pinia. TypeScript, I'm going to choose no. JSX, I'll choose no. And for Vue Router, I'm going to choose yes by using the arrow keys because we want to demonstrate our Pinia Store working across multiple pages. And I'm also going to choose yes to adding Pinia to our app as well. And for vtest, I'm going to choose no. Cypress, I'll choose no. And for ESLint, which you might want to consider using in your own projects, I'm going to choose no just for simplicity for this project. And it's created the project. We just need to cd into the folder, run npm install to install dependencies, and then run npm run dev. And I'm just going to drag Finder over here, and I can see the folder it's created there, learn Pinia. So I'll drag that into VS Code and open up the terminal and run npm install to install the dependencies. And it's finished installing the dependencies, so we can now just run npm run dev to launch the app. Then we can just command and click on this link to open it in the browser. Let's simplify this Vue 3 starter app as much as possible so that we can use it to start learning Pinia. So this starter app has two pages or two views, home and about. So let's simplify these views first. So I'm going to go to source and views and home view.view. And I'm going to get rid of the script section and get rid of everything inside the template. And I'm just going to add a div with a class of home. And inside that div, I'm going to add a h1 heading with the text home. Then I'm going to copy all of this and save that and jump to about view.view and remove this style section. And just paste over the code from the home view, change the class to about and change the text in the heading to about as well. Save that. And we now have two really simple views. Now let's get rid of all this stuff at the top. And this is in our root component app.view. So source app.view. And again, I'm going to remove this script section and this style section at the bottom. I'm going to select all of that, get rid of that, save that. And all I really want here is our two router link components so that we can navigate our app, and this router view component so that we can display our views. So this nav element, which contains our router links, I'm going to copy that. And then I'm going to select all of this header element and just paste over that, fix the indentation and save that. And just to separate our nav items, I'm just going to add a space and a pipe symbol and another space in between those. And I also want to center everything in our app. So I'm going to add a div with a class of app And then I'm just going to move everything, our nav and our router view component, into that div and save that. And I'll just add a little bit of style so that we can center everything. So I'm going to add .app to target this div with a class of app and just set the text align to center. Save that, and now everything is in the center. And we now have a super simple app which we can use to start learning Pinia. Let's create a simple counter app on our home view in the usual View 3 Composition API way by using reactive data, methods, and computed properties. Well, first of all, let's just set up all of the elements and styles. So let's jump to our home view in source, views, and home view.view. Let's get rid of this H1 heading. I'm going to add a div with a class of count where we can store our counter. And for now, I'm just going to put 0 in there and save that. Let's add a little bit of style for that. So let's add a style tag. Target this div with a class of count, and we'll set the font size to 60 pixels, and we'll add some margin as well. Set that to 20 pixels. Save that. Let's add some buttons for increasing and decreasing this count. So after this div with a class of count, I'll add another div with a class of buttons, and inside that we'll add a button with a minus symbol in it. Duplicate that and add a plus symbol to the other button. And again, let's add a little bit of style to these. So in our style section, we'll target this div with a class of button, and we'll target the button elements inside that. Set the font size to 40 pixels and set the margin to 10 pixels. Save that. Oh, this class should be buttons, not button. So save that. And this is looking pretty decent now. So let's add some data and methods to get this app working. Okay, let's get this counter app actually doing something. And first, let's set up a reactive data ref for our counter. So I'm going to add a script section after our template, script setup tags, and I'll create a constant called count, set that equal to the ref method, and give that an initial value of 0. And I'm going to be running through all of the composition API stuff pretty quickly here. But if you want a full tutorial on View 3 and the Composition API, then check out my View 3 Composition API tutorial series here on YouTube. And since we're using this ref method from View, we need to import that. So I'll add import ref from View. And now let's bind this ref to this counter in our template. So I'll replace this 0 with double curly braces and count and save that. And we still see 0 on the page here, but if we change the initial value of this ref and save it, we can see it updates on the template. So let's set that back to 0. And now let's set up a method for increasing our counter. So I'll create a constant called increase count, set that equal to an arrow function. And for now, we'll just log out increase count and save that. And let's trigger this method when this plus button is clicked. So we'll add a click handler to this button, so at click, and we'll trigger this increase count method, save that. And let's just make sure that's being triggered. And yeah, that's being triggered. So to access the value of this count ref, we can just do count.value. And then to increase it by 1, we can just add plus plus. So let's save that and see if that's working. Reload, click on the button. And yeah, we can see our counter increasing by 1. So now let's also set up a method for decreasing the count. So I'll just duplicate this increase count method, rename it to decrease count, and instead of count.value plus plus, we'll do count.value minus minus to decrease the count by 1. So let's trigger this method when our minus button is clicked. So we'll add another click handler here on this minus button and fire this decrease count method. Save that, reload, let's just check it's all working. Yeah, we can increase our counter by 1 and we can decrease our counter by 1 as well. Let's use a computed property to display whether our number is odd or even. Let's add the markup for that first. So after this div with a class of buttons, I'm going to add a HR just to add a line across the page. And then I'll add another div, and inside that I'll put the text, this counter is, and for now I'll just put odd/even, although we're going to use a computed property to spit out either odd or even, depending on the value of the number. So let's jump to our script section and add our computed property. So I'll create a const called odd or even, set that equal to the computed method, and pass an arrow function into that. And since we're using this computed method, we need to import that from Vue. So I'll add that to this import line at the top, so computed. And we can use the remainder operator to determine whether this number is odd or even. So what we can do is if count.value remainder 2 is equal to 0. In other words, if we divide this count by 2 and get the remainder, and that remainder is 0, then we know that this number is even. So if that's the case, we'll return the text even. Otherwise, we'll return the text odd. So let's save that, and we should now be able to use this computed property on our template. So I'll select the text odd/even, and instead we'll use double curly braces and spit out our computed property, so odd or even, and save that. Let's reload and see if this is working. So our counter is set to 0, and we can see the counter is even. If we increase it to 1, then we can see the counter is odd, and so on. So this computed property is now working. So what we want to do now is move our app's data and methods into a Pinia store. But first of all, what is Pinia? Well, it's a state management library similar to Vuex, but optimized for Vue 3 and the composition API. And it also has many improvements over Vuex. But basically, Pinia allows us to store all of our app's core data and all of the methods related to modifying that data and getting that data in one single centralized place in a Pinia store. And all of the components in our app have access to the data and the methods which are in that store. But why might we need to keep all of our app's core data and methods in one single centralized place? Well, right now, all of our app's core data and methods are stored in this homeview.vue component. But let's say we also wanted to use our counter on our about page, and maybe use some of the counter's related methods on the about page as well. Well, right now this would be quite difficult because the about view component is a sibling of the home view component. And there's no easy way of passing data from a sibling component to a sibling component. So what we would need to do is move our data ref and our methods and our computed property into our root component app.vue. And then we would need to pass the count data ref down to the child components, home view and about view using props or by using provide inject. And then in order for our home view and about view components to change the counter by triggering our increase count or decrease count methods, we would need to fire a custom event on these child components. And then in the parent component app.vue, we would need to listen out for those custom events before we can finally trigger the methods and update the counter. And so this gets very complicated very quickly. The more complicated your app gets, and the more deeply nested your component tree becomes. But with Pinia and state management, we don't need to worry about having to pass data down to child components using props, and we don't need to worry about firing custom events in child components and listening out for those events in parent components, because all of the components in our app have access to all of the data and methods in our Pinia store. So using state management such as Pinia makes it much easier for us to manage our app's core data, and it also makes it much easier for us to break our app up into child components, which is something you're definitely going to want to do in a more complicated app. And I will demonstrate breaking up our app into child components later on in the video. Now, when we created our app using the build tool, it actually installed Pinia for us and created a basic Pinia store as well. And this is in source, stores, and counter.js. So let's take a look at this. So in a Pinia store, we basically have three main sections: state, actions, and getters. And the state is just where we store our data properties. So we're going to be moving our count into the state in our store. And actions are methods which allow us to access the data that's in the state and modify it. So we're going to be moving our increase count and decrease count methods into actions. And getters allow us to grab something from the state, grab a data property from the state, and modify it in some way, or generate something based on that data property. and then return something. So you could think of getters as the state management equivalent of computed properties, in that the result of a getter is cached and only updated when its dependencies change. In other words, when the state properties which are being used by that getter are changed. So we're going to be moving our odd or even computed property into a getter. But for now, let's remove the actions and getters so that we can just focus on state. And I'm also going to empty out the state by removing this property here. Let's save that. So the state in our Pinia Store is just for storing reactive data properties. And right now in HomeView.view, we have this count data ref, which we're using for our counter. So let's move this into our state in our Pinia Store. So we'll jump to counter.js and we'll add a property called count and give that an initial value of 0. And we can add as many state properties as we like. So we might add a name property, set that to a string, maybe a username property, etc. But for this video, we're just going to use this one count property. So I'll get rid of these and save that. And now let's use this count property that's in our state, in our store, on our homepage here for our counter, instead of this local data ref which we set up on HomeView.view. So first of all, we need to import our store into this component. And what we want to import is this method here, use counter store, which is set to this define store method. So we want to import use counter store from this file counter.js. So we can just add import curly braces, use counter store from, and we can use the @ symbol to get to our source folder. And this is just an alias which is set up in the vite config file, which you can find in the root of our project, vite.config.js. And we can see that alias here. So we can just do import use counter store from @/stores/counter. And in order to use our store in this component, we need to assign it to a variable or constant. So I'll create a new constant, and you can call this anything you want. You could just call it counter, or you could just call it store, but I'm going to call it store counter. And we'll just set that equal to this use counter store method. So use counter store parentheses and save that. And now that we've assigned our store to a constant, we should be able to see it in the View DevTools. And if you don't have the View DevTools, then just jump to the Chrome extension store and search for View DevTools. But once that's installed, we can click on this double arrow and then View. And yeah, we can now see our Pinia Store here. And if we click on that, we can see the state property which we added, this count property. And we can also modify that by using these plus or minus buttons, or by clicking on the pencil and typing in a value. So let's use this count property from our state, from our Pinia Store, on our home view instead of this count data ref. And now that we've imported our store and assigned it to this constant store counter, we can use this store counter constant to access all the stuff that's in our store. So if we just jump to our count here and these double curly braces, to access our store, we can just use that constant store counter. And then to access a property which is in our state, we can just do dot and then the name of the property. So we can just do store counter.count. And with Vuex, we had to specify the state like this, store counter.state.count. And with actions, we had to fire the dispatch action. And for mutations, we had to fire the commit method. But with Pinia, we don't need to specify exactly whether we're using state, actions, or getters. Pinia just figures it out for us. So all we need to do to access our count property is store counter.count. So if we save that now and reload, then we can see 0 on the page. And if we jump to counter.js and change this to 10 and reload, then we now see 10 on the page. So we now know that we're using this count property from our state, from our Pinia Store, and not this local data ref count, which we set up earlier. And again, we can also modify our state properties using the DevTools, and we should see it update in real time. So if we click on these plus and minus buttons, we can see our state property count updating on the template. Actions allow us to access the data properties which are in our state and modify them. So let's create some actions for increasing and decreasing this counter. So after this state method and objects, we can just add a comma, and then we want to create an object called actions, and we can store all of our actions in here. So let's create an action called increase count. And then after that, we'll add a comma and another action called decrease count. And to access our state properties within an action, we can just use the this keyword, a bit like we did with the options API when accessing properties in our data object. So to access this count property in our state, we can just do this.count, and we want to increase that by 1, so we can just do this.count plus plus. And then for the decrease count method, we can just do this.count minus minus. So I'll save that. And now let's trigger these actions when we click on our buttons instead of the local methods which we set up earlier. So let's jump up to our buttons and our click handlers, and we'll fire these actions here. Now in Vuex, we had to do something like store counter dot dispatch, parentheses, and then the name of our action, increase count. But in Pinia, we don't need to do anything like this. We can just simply do store counter dot and then the name of our action. So to trigger our increase count action, we can just do store counter dot increase count. And then I'll copy that, and we can just do the same thing for the minus button, except we're going to do store counter dot decrease count. So I'll just change that and save that, and let's see if this is working. So I'll click on the button, and yeah, we can see our count increasing. Click on the minus button and we can see it decreasing. And we can also see the count property updated in real time in the DevTools as well. So getters are the state management equivalent of computed properties. They allow us to grab a data property from our state and modify it in some way or generate something based on that state property and return a value which can be used by any of our components. And that return value is cached and only updated when the state properties which that getter is depending on change. So let's replace the odd or even computed property on our home view component with a getter in our store. So let's jump to counter.js, and after our actions we can add a comma, and we want to create an object called getters where we can store all of our getters. So to create a getter, we add an object property with the name of our getter. So let's create a getter called odd or even, and we want to set this equal to an arrow function like this. And then in order to access the data properties in our state, we need to pass in the state as a parameter like this. So let's jump back to homeview.view. And let's copy the code inside this computed property and modify it. So I'll copy that, the if statement and the return statement, and we'll paste that in here. And we're no longer going to be looking for count.value in this if statement. We want to grab this count property in our state. And again, we can access our state properties using this state parameter. So we can just replace count.value with state.count. And this getter should be ready to go now. So if we take our count at state.count and divide it by 2 and get the remainder, and that remainder is equal to 0, then we're going to return the string even. Otherwise, we're going to return the string odd. So let's save that and use this getter on our home view component instead of this computed property. So let's jump up to the markup, and this is where we were using the computed property. And remember, we can access everything in our store using this store counter const, which we set up before. And in Vuex, we would need to do something like store counter.getters dot and then the name of our getter. But in Pinia, we don't need to do this. We can just do store counter dot and then the name of our getter, which is odd or even. So we can just do store counter dot odd or even. So let's save that and reload and see if this is working. So when our counter is 0, we can see this counter is even. And if we increase it, we can see it changes to this counter is odd, and so on. And we can also see the result of our getter in our View DevTools as well. And we can see that updating in real time. Okay, so back to homeview.view. we're no longer using this count ref or these increase count and decrease count methods, and we're no longer using this computed property. All of our app's core data and methods are now in our store and they're all hooked up. So we can now just remove these, remove the computed property, the two methods, and this ref. And since we're now no longer using these ref and computed methods from Vue, we can remove this import line as well. And save that, and let's just make sure everything is still working. And yeah, everything is still working. Two-way data binding is super simple with Pinia. So let's say we want to add an input to our page and we want to use that to modify our count. Well, all we need to do is bind that input to the state property in our store by using vModel. So let's jump to homeview.view, and after this div with the odd or even getter, I'm going to add another HR and another div, and inside that div I'll add a h3 with the text edit counter colon, and then after that I'll add an input and we'll give this a type of number, and I'll split the attributes on that using the split HTML attributes extension, which you can grab from the VS Code extension store, and I'll save that. And now if we want to bind this input to our state property count, then all we need to do is add a vModel directive, and since we have our store assigned to this store counter constant, we can just set this vModel to store counter dot and then the name of our state property, which is count, and save that. And we can now see the number 0 in this input. And if we click on these buttons, then we can modify the count, or we can just type a new value into this input, and we can see that updated on the template. To demonstrate how simple Pinia and state management make it for us to share our core data and methods anywhere within our app, let's add a simple counter to our about page. So I'm going to jump to source, views, and about view.view. And after this heading here, I'm going to add a button with a class of counter-button. And I'll just put the text 0 in that button for now, save that. And let's add a bit of style to make this a bit bigger. So we'll target the counter-button class. Set the font size to 50 pixels, save that. And again, if we want to use everything in our store here, we will need to import our store and assign it to a variable or constant. So let's add our script setup tags. And again, we're going to import, use counter store from @/stores/counter. And again, we need to assign this to a constant or variable. So I'll create a constant called store counter again, and set that equal to use counter store parentheses. And we can now use everything in our store in this component. So first of all, let's bind the count property from our state to the text that's in this button here. So let's replace this 0 with double curly braces and store counter dot count. Save that, and we can see that just updated to 70 because that's the value it has on the home page. So you can see the value of our counter is always kept up to date regardless of where we are within our app. And let's also increase this counter when we click on this button. So I'll split the attributes on the opening tag of this button and add a click handler, and we want to fire our increase count action. So we can just do store counter dot increase count. Save that, click on the button, and we can see the counter is increased. And it now reads 78. And if we jump back to the home page, it says 78 here as well. Now that all of our app's core data and methods are in a Pinia store, it's going to be super easy for us to break our app up into child components without having to mess around sending props around from parent to child, and without having to emit custom events from child components and set up listeners for those events on parent components. So to demonstrate this on our home view, let's just quickly put this counter, this div with a class of count, into its own child component. So I'm going to jump to the Explorer and in the components folder. Oh, and by the way, we don't need any of these components in here. So I'm just going to delete all of those. And I'm going to create a new component in this folder called counter.view. And then we'll add our template tags. And we'll jump back to homeview.view. And then this div with a class of count, we're just going to cut that. Jump back to counter.view and paste that in here. And again, to use our store, we'll need to import it and assign it to a variable or constant. So I'm just going to jump to homeview.view and copy all of this script section and paste it into counter.view and save that. And now let's use this component on homeview.view. So I'll import this at the top here. So we can just do import counter from @/components/counter.view, save that, and we should now be able to use that counter. So we'll place that here at the top of this div with a class of home. So counter, and save that, reload, and we can see the counter on the page again. And let's see if it's still working. And yeah, we can see everything is still working straight away without having to mess around with props, provide inject, or custom events. If you want to learn more about Pinia, including how to add Pinia to an existing Vue 3 project from scratch without the build tool doing it for you, how to add parameters to your actions and getters, and how to create more of a real-world kind of app with full CRUD capabilities and more complicated data structures, then check out my course Vue.js 3 Composition API with Pinia and Vite. And of course, you'll also learn all of the basics of the Composition API as well. And at the time I'm recording this, the course is rated 4.8 stars out of 5. And you can grab it with my special discount at dannys.link/compositionapi. Thanks for watching, and I'll leave you with the promo video. If you're already familiar with Vue 2 and the Options API, then this course will teach you everything you need to know to switch over to and get started with Vue 3 and the incredible new Composition API. My name's Danny. I'm an indie app developer and creator of Fudgit, the highest rated personal finance app for iOS, Android, Mac and Windows. And I've spent the last 12 months creating Fudgit 2, which is built on Vue 3 and the Composition API. In this course, you'll start by learning the key differences between the Options API and the Composition API, by creating a simple Options API app and converting it to the Composition API. Then you'll master all of the basics, including reactive data with refs and reactive objects, methods, computed properties and watchers, lifecycle hooks, directives, Vue router, child components, including the new ways of handling props, emits and model value, dynamic components, composables, how to create them from scratch, and how to import them from the Vue Use library, and you'll learn state management using Pinia, the incredible successor to Vuex. After learning these basics, you're going to create a real-world app called Noteballs from scratch, which has full CRUD capabilities, uses Pinia for state management, and demonstrates real-world use of all the basics that you learned earlier. After this course, you'll be able to create your own Vue 3 apps based entirely on the Composition API, completely from scratch. This course requires a basic understanding of Vue 2 and the Options API, HTML, CSS and JavaScript. Please check out the preview videos, and I look forward to seeing you in the course.